Okay, welcome to Towards Acceptance, Effective Intercultural Practices. I decided to record this presentation again because whenever you just share the recording of a webinar, it doesn't work as well as intended. If you could not participate in our presentation, I hope you enjoy the recording. Let me make myself smaller here. Okay, and start the slideshow. Probably should make myself even smaller. Okay, here it is. Let's start. The materials for this presentation are on the page professorwildermuth.com. So if you go to professorwildermuth.com, that is my academic page, and you see that there's an area that says leadership resources and webinar materials. If you go in there, right at the top, you should see effective intercultural practices, and then you'll see a copy of these slides and also a copy of some other resources that I used during the presentation. And that, I didn't realize that I had clicked on it, but okay, here we go. So I'm going to go to the leadership resources and no, I'm not going to presentations. By the way, this film is going to be delightfully imperfect because I'm just recording on the fly. Here it is. Towards Acceptance, you see the link to the Google Slides, the link to a personal culture reflection handout that we used during the presentation, and information on the Intercultural Development Inventory. Awesome. Okay. Right. The SHRM, we shared the SHRM certification number in the presentation, but my understanding, this is something you would have to check with SHRM, but my understanding is that something that is recorded like that, you cannot use for the SHRM certification number. So if you weren't in the session, please do not use the number unless you call SHRM and they tell you something differently. And just as a means of introduction, I am the program leader for the Master of Science in Leadership Development at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. Very proud of our program, very proud of our students. We have a great community. I'm always excited when I run these presentations and some of my alumni come back. So if you want to find out more about us and what we do, please go to drake.edu/leadership. This, just a little bit about me. I am not a terribly formal person, just in case you haven't noticed yet, just by the way that I'm presenting this. I love, love, love Disney World. This is my husband, Mel, and my daughter, Maggie, and whatever wonderful cast member at Disney was playing Elsa. And this was the last time we went to Disney World, and we're definitely hoping to go again, maybe at the end of this year, because we're all huge Disney fans. This is where I'm from originally, so if you're hearing an accent, I'm originally from the beautiful city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. If it's not in your bucket list, it should be in your bucket list. Okay, so the content of this presentation, we're going to talk about culture, and I have a few questions to ask you. In the session, we actually had some polls, but if you're watching this afterwards, I would invite you to think about your answers to the questions and then move on. We're going to talk about what is myth and reality in EDI interventions, more specifically EDI workshops, training, like educational sorts of interventions. And then I'm going to introduce Bennett's model, Milton Bennett's model of intercultural development, and connect that to applications. Okay. During the session, I begged people for some flexibility. We never get to the end, so that's one of the reasons why I'm recording this now. So let's start with culture and you. And if you look at the materials in the Professor Wildermuth page, you're going to see this personal culture reflection, which includes a series of questions that you can ask yourself. In the session, what I did is I just asked people to click on the spinner and just picked one at random. But this is a series of questions that you can ask each other, maybe in a brown bag lunch or so on, about people's childhoods and what they learned about themselves as they were growing up and what that has to do with culture. Just a warning that I shared with people in the presentation. These conversations about childhood can feel triggering to some folks. So you might want to have a trigger warning. You might want to find out if that would be uncomfortable for anybody before you have these kinds of conversations, especially at work. Okay. So the main question here is, what did you learn from your parents or caretakers as you were growing up? And I would invite you, if you're watching this after the presentation, to either go to the personal culture reflection and answer some of those questions for yourself, or at the very least, quickly pause the tape and answer the questions before we move on. Okay. So we're going to follow up with some questions, and then I'll go back to what I learned, right? So after answering these questions, I'll go back to debrief the whole thing. So the first cultural situation is this. You're leaving for a meeting with a colleague. If you don't leave now, you will be late. Another colleague asks for urgent help that will only take you a couple of minutes. But if you stay, you are going to be at least a couple of minutes late. So what do? Do you tell the colleague that you can't help them now because that will make you late? I tell her I'll help her after my meeting, or I help the colleague and I tell the colleagues with whom I'm meeting that I'm late because I had to help somebody else. So what's your first instinct reaction? A or B? Take a note and then go on. Cool. Let's go to my second question. Your daughter or son says that they would rather go to school close to home and live at home during at least part of the college years. They feel that they will feel homesick. Now assume, as you're reading this question, that your daughter or son has no psychological or physical problems. So this is just a matter of comfort. A, I encourage my daughter or son to go explore the world. It's time to stretch their wings and build independence. Or B, I encourage my daughter or son to do exactly what makes them comfortable. There is plenty of time to spread their wings later. A or B? Next question. You're spending, and I'm going to put a blank there, enter whatever important religious holiday is, whatever holiday is important for you, maybe a religious holiday, or maybe you're not religious and it's another type of important holiday for you. So you're spending that holiday, whatever it is, with your family. You know that a new colleague has recently moved to town and may be alone for the holiday. Assume that you're not the party host. Maybe the party host is your mom, maybe the party host is your brother or sister or, a family member. What would you do? A, I'm sure my colleague will be fine, sorry for the typo, and would probably be uncomfortable in a family gathering. Besides, I'm not the host. Or B, I ask the host to welcome one more person and ask the colleague to come spend the holiday with my family. What do you think you would answer? A or B? Once again, stop the tape, answer the question, and then move on. Okay, and finally, last question. Your grandmother's cousin's daughter is coming to town. She has never visited your town before. She contacts you and politely lets you know she is coming. You say, that's lovely, let me know if I can help. What information do you need? Or B, invite the rest of the family to visit your grandmother's cousin's daughter. What do you think your answer would be? Pause the tape, answer. And now I'm going to wrap everything up. Culture is a set of rules, and it's a set of very complex rules. They are not in writing. We don't share them with one another often because they are kind of comfortable glasses that we don't realize that we are wearing, and we usually learn them very early on. So with those questions about what did we learn from our parents, what was considered good or bad, what did I get punished for or rewarded for, there are lots of cultural tidbits that I learned along the way, not only from my direct family, like my father, mother, siblings, but also from my extended family, because coming from Brazil, the concept of family is different. So, for example, what's the value of time? It's not that for me time doesn't matter, is that time matters less than, for example, helping a friend, helping a colleague. And also, what is late is culturally determined. So, for example, where I come from, in many situations, being 5 minutes late is not a huge deal. It may be a huge deal if I'm in a job interview. It may not be a huge deal if I'm having a weekly meeting with my colleagues who know me well. It may be a bigger deal if my boss is there. It really depends. And I was on purpose very vague on that case. But in general, my gut reaction when I look at that case was just a couple of minutes, I would help my colleague. And then I would tell the other people, hey guys, I'm sorry I'm a little late. It's just that I was helping somebody. And people would probably accept that fairly well. If growing up, I had been told 1,000 times that if you're not 5 minutes early or 10 minutes early, you're actually late, my response could have been different. What is the value of independence? That situation actually happened to my own daughter during her undergraduate years in the US. I live in the US and have lived here for 30 years. Um, we dutifully paid for a dorm and then sorority house and all the things that I felt from the US American standpoint, it would be important. But for her, who was raised with a lot of Brazilian influence, um, independence in those years was not that important. And she really wanted to be with us all the time. And not all the time, but she wanted to actually be with us unless she was with her friends. And that to us was perfectly okay because growing up, independence was not a huge value as you're young. In fact, interdependence among family members is considered far more important. And what's interesting about it is that very often I see the assumption that if the young people, especially college age people, are not learning independence, they are not going to be independent afterwards, which is not really true. My daughter is now living alone in DC in a hostel with lots of friends who are also graduate students, and she's thriving and doing perfectly well. It's just a matter of when is it more important for you to gain independence and when it's not. Who is invited for Christmas? I actually became close to my now husband precisely because he was the colleague who had just arrived and didn't have where to go for Christmas. And in my family growing up, one thing that I learned is thou shalt not let somebody spend Christmas alone. It was a huge value. So if there was a family that had arrived, or a friend who was alone, or somebody's, I don't know, friend from school didn't have where to go, or even somebody espoused a different religion and didn't have where to go for Christmas, like even then, we felt obliged, my mother felt obliged to invite anybody who was alone. That was like a huge value growing up. And finally, what does family mean? Family means extended family. So when I was lucky enough to visit Marbella, Spain, another city you need to put in your bucket list, literally my grandmother's cousin's daughter invited her children, her siblings' children. Like I think there were like 25 people in that lunch. I can't remember. A lot of people who were there to meet me and greet me, and I felt treated like family, even though it could not be more extended family. So the concept of family that I learned, not only as a child, but that I continue learning as part of my cultural background, which is half Spanish, half Portuguese, is family is a big affair, not just the nuclear family. Okay, so just to wrap up this part about cultural programming starts very early. We learn not only from our parents, but also from society at large, from media, from our friends at school, and we learn what works, what doesn't, what gets us punished and rewarded, what gets people happy with us and not happy with us, and we learn it, and it becomes a very deeply set lesson. We receive, if in different cultures, you receive very different messages. So when I say I grew up in Brazil, that doesn't tell you enough. I should say I grew up in an upper middle class family in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, urban, and identifying as white. And all that impacts the culture that I grew up in. So same thing in the United States or in any country where you are, there are different cultures and subcultures in that area, and each of these cultural groups receives very different messages of what does it mean to be family, what does it mean to be independent, what are the values that we promote, what does professionalism mean. Now we're getting into the workplace, and those messages are very different. So we must decipher one another's messages somehow, and let's get along, even though there is no, I guess, official way for us to start sharing our different cultural programmings before we do anything else. I very often recommend that when we are talking about towards effectiveness in intercultural relations, we start discussing culture because it seldom backfires and nobody knows enough. And you can have some fascinating conversations that open the doors for other interventions that can go a little harder, a little deeper, go into topics that could be more sensitive. All right. So let me take a step back and tell you how I got started in diversity. So, oops, I shouldn't have gone there. So I got started in diversity because let me move myself again. Let me put myself at the top and hope that that would be a good place for me to be for the remainder of the presentation. Come on, computer, help me out. There it is. So that's a picture of Rio de Janeiro again. So as an immigrant from Brazil, the assumption was I knew everything there is to know about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Why everybody assumed I knew everything about diversity, equity, and inclusion just because I came from Brazil is something that I still do not know, because I would still hardly consider myself as somebody who knows. In fact, once you say that you know about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's already a problem. We never know. There's too much to learn. But because they assumed I knew, they put me in every diversity committee you could imagine. I was in charge of, I don't know, I was put in so many different committees. I was young, I was probably 30, and I was discussing what people older than 60 retired coming back to school should be discussing. I was asked, I still remember one of my bosses saying, "So, Chris, we are so happy we hired you because we want to have a higher number of African American students coming to our school." And I remember thinking, but I don't know. I don't know about the African American culture. I can't help you there. And even if I could, I wouldn't be the right person to do that. It would not be well received. It would be insensitive. So I'm thinking, like, why are you assuming I know? Just because I'm Brazilian, I know everything about diversity everywhere. But that's pretty much how I got started in the diversity field. I often say I was catapulted into it. And after running multiple diversity sessions, cultural interaction sessions, I started asking myself if anyone was learning, because the sense I had was that at the end of the day, the people who were all on board with diversity were happy-go-lucky, happy with the program, were excited about it, were inspired by it. That the people we were trying to reach had not moved the needle at all, and maybe they were even going backwards. And that takes me to a book called Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute. Reading that book and reading about the introduction story marked me, and I remember this to this day. And briefly, the idea is they start the book with this story that there was a doctor in, I believe, Vienna, Ignaz Semmelweis, in the mid-1800s. And he was in a research hospital, the Vienna General Hospital. He was working in the maternity ward. Presumably, he was an OBGYN, if such specialty existed in those days. And what he started noticing was that there was a very high mortality rate, but that mortality rate was not across the board in all the wards. In fact, the mortality rate in the midwives ward was lower than in the doctor's ward. And there was also a story that when he went on vacations or something, or he left, the death rate actually fell. So he started wondering, okay, am I killing my patients? What is going on? And what he discovered was that it was a research institution, And the doctors, it was considered to be a pride thing to present yourself with all your blood from the research um, so of course what was happening was infection, right? Because the doctors were not taking off their blood stained clothes and they were not washing their hands, and just by instituting hand washing, then Dr. Semmelweis managed to reduce the death rate. Now, what this story reminds me of is first the tenet of first do no harm. So one thing that we don't want to do in EDI initiatives is make things worse than they were before. And also, my question was, okay, the way that we are doing, or that I am personally doing, planning diversity sessions, could I be causing harm? Could I be actually moving people backwards? Okay, so with that, I'm going to take a little break again and ask you to be a little interactive, even if you're watching this, and answer some of the questions that I have coming up. So the first one, darn, I'm going to have to move myself again. First question. The Hispanic population is projected to grow more than 90% between 2016 and 2060. And I'd like you to quickly think, is this true, false, or you're unsure? All righty. So actually, this is true. So if you see on this, what do you call it? This population distribution, this chart that I got from the Census Bureau, the Hispanic population is growing 93.5%, or at least that's the prediction, between 2016 and 2060. Non-Hispanic whites, that population is going to go down by about 9.5%. Okay, so far so good. That one was actually true. Now here's the other question. Sharing demographic information is a good way of starting to discuss diversity in the workplace. How many times have you been in diversity training sessions in which you were asked, you were told right in the beginning, hey, take a look at the demography, take a look at where the US population is going, or if you're watching this from another country, where's the Indian population going? Where's the Norwegian population going? Wherever you are, take a look at the demographics, what's going to be happening in the next 10 years, 20 years. That's a very common way of starting diversity discussions. I've had those in multiple courses. So would you say that that's a good thing to do? True. Not a good thing to do? False? Or you're not sure? Okay. Next question. We should start our diversity initiatives by encouraging our coworkers to value diversity. In fact, the idea of valuing diversity or valuing differences is often even in the title of diversity initiatives. Would you say, yay, let's do that? False? Or would you say, not sure about that? And finally, I think that's the last one. I hope it is. Our diversity initiatives should focus on helping people find connections. True, false, or unsure? Okay, let me make myself bigger here. I would actually have said unsure to all those questions, except for the first one, in which the question was simply demographic, like is the Hispanic population growing? And that's a matter of fact, yes, right? It likely is. But all the other questions, like should you talk about demographics right in the beginning? Should you tell people to value the importance of valuing diversity? Should you encourage people to find connections? I would say unsure, and here is why. It really depends on where people are in their journey towards intercultural competency or diversity competency. Let me take a step back and tell you that I am like the worst person in math ever. Somehow I managed to learn statistics, but that's only because there's this wonderful software that I use that helps me with stats. Otherwise, I would probably be equally disastrous. I was so bad that I would get like 25% of a test, and my teachers in high school could not understand what on earth was wrong with me. Now, if you put me at that point in some high trigonometry class, and actually they did try to do that, not only you will fail, but you will also scar me for life, and I won't want to be in a math class again. Okay, now let's move that to diversity. What we seem to be doing in our organizations, in our schools, in any environment in which we try to um, enhance people's competency with diversity and cultural relations in a classroom setting or coaching or mentoring or so on, is we are assuming that everybody is at the same level, and we are not. So some things could work beautifully for people who are a little more advanced, um, and not so much for people who are starting their journey and not comfortable with diversity yet. So, for example, talking about demographics is something that for somebody like me who's been in the field for a while and, am fairly comfortable with what I'm doing, that doesn't faze me. I want that information. I find that information interesting. But if you're talking to somebody who is really nervous about diversity and is in a stage in which they see people different from them as somehow threatening, what you've done is just make that person feel even more threatened. What about finding connections? Finding connections is good most of the time, either as a strategy to reach a higher level or as a strategy for people who are in a lower level of development. So, for example, that person who is uncomfortable with diversity, if you emphasize what we have in common, it could be a really good place to go. It's just not a good place to get stuck in. You probably want to go from there into now let's appreciate the differences. But there is a method to this madness. There is a sequence that we need to consider, and different interventions are going to work depending on where people are. All right, let me make myself small again and move on. So, why does all of that matter? Because if you use the wrong interventions, you could do what they would have done if they had put me in trigonometry when I was struggling with basic geometry. You could be killing your patients. And in our metaphor here, killing our patients means making things worse and making it so that people don't want to move forward. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to a brilliant man. His name is Dr. Milton Bennett, American sociologist and author of multiple books and articles, but he's also the creator of the developmental model of cultural sensitivity. Here are some important quotes from Dr. Bennett. The first one is that I find fascinating is the idea that intercultural sensitivity is not natural. It is not part of our primate past, nor has it characterized most of human history. In fact, he says, cross-cultural contact usually has been accompanied by bloodshed, oppression, or genocide. And if you think about it and you look around, open the newspaper, dig a little bit, you're probably going to find horrible things happening, whatever day it is that you're watching this presentation, all over the world. So the idea that discrimination, racism, poor diversity relations are just happening in country X is, honestly, I wish it were so. I wish only one country had that problem. In reality, that's part of our human journey. Another quote from Bennett: the concept of fundamental difference in cultural worldview is the most problematic and threatening idea that many of us ever encounter. Now, early on, I gave you some lighthearted examples. I asked you to whether you would be a couple of minutes late to a meeting or whether you would invite somebody for a holiday party. But when you get into values and beliefs and concepts of right and wrong, ethics, professionalism, and you name it, you can get into pretty threatening territory. In other words, intercultural encounters are not easy, and we're treating them as if they were. What we're actually trying to do is we're changing our natural tendencies that from an evolutionary standpoint are tribal. We learned to like the people whom we perceive to be like us because those would be members of our tribe. We like our boxes and we tend not to like people outside other boxes. At least we tend not to until we learn that there are bigger boxes that we can be part of. But in the beginning, that's the natural tendency. And when we try to encourage people to work with people whose culture is different from them, what we're trying to do is to change the natural tendency. The good news, human beings have the rational capacity to do just that. But as we build those educational interventions, we need to consider what the natural tendencies are in the first place. So valuing differences, there was one question about that. Hey, should we encourage people to value differences? It's actually a pretty advanced concept, and it's not where I would start. So if you ask people who are already getting comfortable with differences, now how do we value them? How do we capitalize on them? How do we move on from them? That is probably a really good thing to do. But if you're doing that with people who are very uncomfortable with differences or who don't even know that differences exist, that could be too much too soon. Okay, so let's take a step back and look at intercultural stages of development, again from Dr. Bennett. He had basically two levels, ethnocentric and ethnorelative. And the ethnocentric stage, differences are hidden or threatening. You either don't know where they are, that they are there, or you're threatened by them. And ethnorelative differences are accepted and valued. Within the ethnocentric stages, there are two substages. One is denial, in which you don't really see relevant differences, or you just see surface ones, like people dress differently or they have different foods, but you don't see anything under the surface. And defense, in which you do see that there are differences and you don't like them. Now, if you look at Dr. Bennett's model, you will see that this third stage that I will include here, he also puts that under ethnocentrism. And that stage is we have more in common than we have differences. We're all children of the same God, or we're all brothers and sisters. We're all human beings. And the tendency here is to try to mask the differences that you identified. The reason that Dr. Bennett puts that under ethnocentrism is that you're still prioritizing your culture and you're ignoring anything, you're purposely ignoring anything that does not fit your cultural view. My personal thought is that minimization is an interesting stage in between, almost like a bridge between ethnocentrism and ethnorelativism. And as a bridge stage, it is a good bridge for you to pass. It is a good so that question about should you ask people to form connections, I would say yes, in certain stages, in certain moments, forging connections is really important. Why? Because before you can accept differences, you need to be having dialogue with people who are different from you. Before you can be comfortable with different cultural worldviews or cultural values, you need to understand what those values are. And if you don't forge connections with people and talk to them, you're probably never going to find out what those values are and what those different worldviews are in the first place. In my practice, with my husband Mel, we call this conversity. That was a term that my then business partner, Susan Gray. Susan, if you're listening to this, I'm still thankful to you and all the great conversations we had so many years ago. But the word we use is conversity, and conversity means intentional conversations to reach connections. So, do I think forging connections is important? Absolutely. Now, is it enough? Well, that depends on where you are. I would say, depending on the stage, it's not. And here we get into the ethnorelative stages in Bennett's model, acceptance and adaptation. In acceptance, you accept cultural differences and value differences, and you start trying to adjust your behaviors to respect the other person's worldview. So when you're talking about people in acceptance and all you're doing is trying to find connections, it could backfire, because people are going to be saying, you are minimizing this. Minimization. You're making this look like my culture doesn't matter, like different cultures from the mainstream culture, whatever on earth that means, doesn't matter. So if I'm dealing with people, if I'm working with people who are moving farther in their diversity and cultural interactions journey, I'm not going to get stuck in just connections conversations. I'm going to want to talk about differences at that point. So you see how that works. It really depends on where people are. And finally, adaptation is the most advanced. Well, let me take a step back. It is not the most advanced stage according to Milton Bennett's model. There is still another one that he calls integration, but it's the one for which actual data have been identified. They didn't identify anything after that. Integration is kind of like a supraculture or on top of culture or a cultural sort of model. And the reality is everybody seems to have a preferred culture, even if they're fairly comfortable moving across cultures. But in adaptation, you are so comfortable with intercultural relations, specific, and usually that happens between a couple of cultures, like you're very good moving from culture X to culture Y, but not necessarily with all others. In adaptation, you can be a little bit of a chameleon. You can move from one culture to the other. You can understand how ethical reasoning occurs in these two cultures. You can understand things from two points of view. The reason that I named my presentation towards acceptance instead of towards adaptation is that I feel that adaptation is too advanced a level. And in my practice, I will share with you in a moment the assessment that we use to measure that. In my practice, the only people that I see in adaptation are fully bicultural people like myself who immigrated a long time ago and therefore are very comfortable navigating two different cultures, or people who are children of somebody from a different culture. And once again, they have a lot of practice navigating two cultures, but it's very rare. So I would say that if we got people towards acceptance, we're good. Okay, so the question that I asked people is, where are you? Where do you think you are? Denial, defense, minimization, acceptance, or adaptation? Now, I'm going to make a prediction here. And my prediction is that most of you, after I gave these explanations, probably put yourselves in acceptance, because that's what most people do. And that's where it gets interesting for you to actually complete an assessment. But let me regroup. We're typically pretty bad at estimating our own comfort with cultural differences. So whatever it is that you said could be right, but it's fairly likely wrong. At least I will say this. When I look at the assessments that I've been interpreting and helping my students and my clients process for many years now, the likelihood that what they estimated is actually where they are is very, very small. So in comes an inventory that I did not create. I take no credit for it. This is the Intercultural Development Inventory. It was created by Mitch Hammer and colleagues. It is available. I don't know if I linked this page, but if you go to the page professorwildermuth.com and you go to where I suggested early on, you will see that I put a link to the company in there. You do have to be certified to be able to conduct this instrument. This instrument should only be used for coaching purposes. They are very strict and serious at the IDI. For example, it should never be used for selection or anything like that. It's only for developmental reasons, and they're adamant about each person who is going through something like that should be coached and so on. So I am a qualified user of the IDI, and I have run like countless interpretations of the IDI to clients and especially to my students. All right. One interesting component of the IDI is that they give you information on two types of orientation, one orientation or place in that scale. One is what they call the perceived orientation, and the other is the developmental orientation. The perceived orientation is where you think you are, and the developmental orientation is where you actually are. So, for example, let's see this, fictional or sample example here. This person, for example, I can't remember which was the top. I think the top, yeah, I'm pretty sure. The top is the perceived orientation. So this person saw themselves in acceptance, which is very common. But actually, this person was in minimization, which means that this person was prioritizing what they had in common with other people in order to perhaps avoid some of the discomfort of cultural differences. Here's another example. Somebody felt that they were in minimization at the cusp of acceptance, but they were actually in denial. So what? All right. So the first thing that I said that I wanted to reinforce is that we are terrible measuring ourselves. So if you truly want to know where you are, you might want to complete the IDI or some other similar assessment that would give you a sense of where you might be in your developmental journey. I don't know of other assessments. I'm not necessarily trying to sell this one because really I have no commission on IDI or nothing to do with them other than I like their instrument and I use it at work and with my students, and I find it good. But whatever assessment you use, the reality is we're very bad estimating that. And the second point here is that specific interventions work best for specific stages. So for example, let's say that somebody is in denial. They don't know that cultural differences exist. And what you're really trying to get them is awareness. Hey, you know what? Not everybody is like you. That's where you're trying to go. But you're going to try to go a little bit beneath the surface so that they don't think that culture is only about the clothes people wear or the food they eat. And you also want to do that in a very positive way because you don't want to evoke negative feelings or they'll stop learning. They'll shut themselves down. You want them to have positive feelings so that they can come back and continue learning. So some interventions, celebrations, interesting surface level differences, but then you also want to go to a little bit deeper, interesting differences, fun differences. For example, the surface level could be the celebration, but then you could talk a little bit about what's behind that celebration. I have seen all sorts of articles in which people really said, hey, if organizations, all they're doing is international night or a food night or I don't know, Brazilian food festival, that's actually bad for diversity relations. I wouldn't say it's bad for diversity relations at all. I'd say it probably can do no harm unless you do it in a very stereotypical way. It's part of your diversity and inclusion arsenal. It's just not enough. And it's probably pretty good for people who are like, oh, diversity? What? I grew up in some small town and I really had never any contact with anybody from outside my neck of the woods. Now, let's say that people are in defense. I don't like differences, right? Like I am feeling really nervous about immigrants, about people of a different gender, race, gender orientation, sexual orientation, gender identity, like anybody who is different from me, I'm going to feel very uncomfortable with that. So what's your goal? You're trying to reduce the fear and the anxiety. We're trying to get them to we're all in this together, once again, because you don't want to alienate them and move them backwards. So possible interventions, we're all in this together, intentionally seek connections. That's what I was talking about before when I used the term conversity. Intentional conversations to find common things to do. And also, if you could put these people in the same team, different people, but in the same team trying to reach a common goal, like, I don't know, you're going to play baseball against the other team. Sorry, need to stop this. That would probably be pretty beneficial. Minimization. Aren't we all the same? So now what we're trying to do with them is movement towards acceptance. So what could you do? Now let's go into our cultural background. Some of those conversations like I had in the beginning in terms of what did you learn? What was your programming? Gently experiencing differences. Yes, let's talk about what we have in common, but then let's move forward and start talking about differences. And it's very important that you consider as you're putting people together that you want equal status. So if all your, for example, let's say, how do I say this? If all your top CEO executives and so on are from the majority culture, ethnicity, race, and everybody in the training comes from a different racial, ethnic, cultural background, you're establishing a power dynamic right there and then. So you probably want to make sure that the status is similar amongst the people who are participating in those exercises. By the way, one thing that I didn't say before is diversity and inclusion education doesn't work very well with huge groups. If you could make small groups and think about a curriculum rather than a one-day thing, that will probably work better for you because people will develop some trust over time and they can then open up and feel more comfortable in what they're doing. Acceptance. All right, we're getting into the higher levels, right? So they already respect cultural differences. So now you want in-depth knowledge, imagination, and adaptation. You want people to start thinking of ethical decisions, looking from different cultural backgrounds. Now you're getting into the fun, advanced level. Interventions. Focus on one culture at a time because you really can't get that advanced with all cultures in the world. Focus on considerable contact. So maybe there could be some challenges of how you can integrate yourself into that culture. How can you immerse yourself to really understand? Maybe some development for executives who need to have a lot of contact with a particular culture in the world is to send them there for a sojourn for a while to actually understand what's happening. That's where you really want to have challenging conversations and experiences and look at biases that are still lurking and you want to go into more. That's your advanced calculus or whatever comes after calculus. In general, one thing that we often don't do in diversity intervention, specifically education, diversity education, cultural development, and education, and so on, is we don't measure. We don't know where we are. And if you don't know where you are, you can't come up with effective interventions. So measure before you move. Consider the stages of development and the stage of development where your potential students are. Include non-traditional interventions. And what I mean by non-traditional interventions is don't only think about classroom, book clubs, discussions, team competitions, baseball matches, right? Like think about good old-fashioned team building. Think about ways in which you can bring people together and comfortable talking to each other. So that's what I have in here: travel, ongoing book clubs, intercultural discussions, challenges, coaching, immersion, and so on. And remember, of course, we've been talking a lot about education here because that was the purpose of this session. But remember that equity, diversity, and inclusion are not only about, they will never increase only with education. Education is a little part of the process. You